Tonight we drift back into the wooden desks, ink-stained fingers and cold stone walls of the Victorian classroom. It was a world of chalk dust floating in beams of sunlight, of slates scraped thin, of stiff collars and restless shoes tapping under benches. And it was also a world of discipline. Strange, strict, and sometimes downright peculiar. So, dim your lights, settle under your blanket, and let your thoughts wander gently into the past. If this calm journey helps you unwind, you may tap like or subscribe. Only if it feels right, of course. And if you'd like, share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love imagining these little stories reaching you in your own quiet corner of the world at just the right hour. Now, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and follow me into the hush of the Victorian schoolroom. Imagine a classroom in 1860. Long rows of wooden benches, the smell of chalk, the sharp sound of a cane tapping on the floor. The children sit in stiff silence, their slates balanced on knees, their eyes downcast. In this world, silence was not simply encouraged, it was rewarded. Victorian teachers believed that silence was the key to learning, the proof of obedience, the mark of a well-trained child. To sit still, lips sealed, was to be considered good. But the reward for such silence was not always kind words. Sometimes it was a token, a medal of silence, given to the child who kept quiet the longest. Picture a small boy, hands clasped tightly together on the desk. He longs to whisper to his neighbour, to share a joke about the ink smudge on the master's collar, but he dares not. His eyes dart to the teacher's hand, where a small round medal glimmers. It will be pinned on one child's chest at the end of the day, and he wants it desperately. Not because it is beautiful, but because it means safety. The child who holds the medal is praised. The child who speaks out of turn is shamed. And so silence becomes a contest, a daily ritual of restraint. Children shift uncomfortably, suppressing coughs, biting lips to hold back giggles. The room hums not with voices, but with the quiet tension of unspoken words. Of course, silence medals sound almost harmless today, a little absurd even. Imagine a prize for saying absolutely nothing, like the opposite of a debate trophy. But in the Victorian mind, it was deadly serious. Noise was disorder. Talking was rebellion. Silence was golden, not just as a saying, but as a physical token pressed against a child's chest. Now, imagine the end of the day. The teacher stands, medal in hand. Children hold their breath, shoulders tense. At last, he pins it to a girl in the front row. Her face burns with pride, or perhaps relief. For one night she will not be scolded at home for failing, for one night she is safe. And yet as the children file out, the silence medal gleams with irony. For what is childhood, if not noisy? What is learning, if not filled with questions and chatter? The medal is a symbol not of joy, but of suppression. It is proof that even in something as natural as a child's voice, the Victorians found cause for discipline. And so, with that quiet token glinting faintly in our mind's eye, we drift softly toward the next chapter, where punishments grew stranger still, and where the price of disobedience could be measured in the pinch of a wooden trap upon a child's thumb. The silence medal glimmers faintly, its irony sinking in, and now we step closer to one of the strangest punishments ever devised for restless children, the thumb trap. Imagine a classroom in 1872. The air is sharp with chalk dust, the master's cane rests across his desk, and the children sit hunched over their slates. Their fingers fidget. One chews the end of a quill, another twirls a lock of hair. And then, in the back row, a small boy sucks nervously at his thumb. For him, it is comfort, a small instinctive act to quiet the storm of fear within. But for the master, it is sin. With a sharp rap of the cane, the boy is called forward. From a drawer, the master produces a curious device, a small wooden frame fitted with a hinge, designed to clamp tightly around a child's thumb. It is not heavy, nor brutal in appearance, yet it carries humiliation like a shadow. The boy's thumb is placed inside, the wooden pieces pressed shut. He winces, not from pain but from shame. His classmates giggle nervously, whispering as he is sent back to his seat. There he must sit, his thumb trapped, unable to write properly, unable to hide his disgrace. The trap is not about injury, it is about exposure. Picture him now, trying to hold his slate, fumbling with chalk. His cheeks burn as his classmates steal glances. He cannot focus on sums or spelling. All he can feel is the weight of eyes, the mark of punishment. The thumb trap has done its job, not in correcting habit, but in branding him before the class. For teachers it was considered clever, even merciful. It left no bruise, required no shouting. But for the child it was a humiliation deeper than the cane's sting. It turned a small private comfort into a spectacle of shame. Some schools used variations, a metal clamp, a strap of leather, even devices with sharp ridges meant to discourage the habit. In every form the message was clear. Even the smallest instinct, if deemed improper, could be seized, controlled, displayed. And so children learned quickly to hide their habits. They tucked their hands beneath desks, bit lips to still themselves, stiffened their movements like tiny soldiers. Childhood softness was pressed flat beneath the rigidity of Victorian order. The thumb trap may sound absurd today, like something from a parody of strict schooling, but for the children who endured it, it was no joke. It was part of a larger system that sought to mold them into silence, obedience, and uniformity. And yet, imagine the whispers after school. A child freed from the trap laughs nervously, showing the red mark on his thumb to friends. They joke about it, mimic the teacher, even dare each other to try the trap themselves. In their laughter there is defiance, the small rebellion of children who know that no trap can truly silence their spirit. So as the trap is placed back into the master's drawer, its wood creaking shut, let us step onward into the next peculiarity of discipline, where punishment was not about thumbs or silence, but about posture and the endless demand that children sit perfectly still, spines straight as rulers, heads unmoving beneath the watchful eye of authority. The thumb trap creaks shut, tucked away into the master's drawer, but the silence in the classroom remains heavy. Children sit stiffly, their slates balanced on narrow desks, their eyes darting only when the teacher turns away. And here, another peculiar demand ruled the day: posture. Victorian teachers believed that the way a child held their body reflected the state of their soul. To slump, to fidget, to tilt one's head was a sign of laziness, of weakness, even of moral decay. And so posture was policed with as much vigilance as sums and spelling. Imagine a row of children in 1865, each sitting bolt upright, hands folded neatly on their desks. The master paces between them, cane tapping on the floor. Back straight, heads high, he commands. Any child caught leaning or resting an elbow is tapped sharply with the cane. Sometimes, posture-correcting devices were introduced. Wooden boards strapped behind a child's back, or collars fitted with stiff supports to keep the head upright. These were not only uncomfortable but humiliating, marking the child as slouching before the whole class. Picture a girl in a faded dress, her shoulders drooping with fatigue. The teacher places a flat board against her spine and ties it with straps. Now she sits bound, her back pressed against the rigid surface. Her eyes sting with shame, her muscles ache, yet she cannot move. The other children stare, trying not to smile, relieved that it is not their turn. In some schools, posture was enforced through objects balanced on heads, books, slates, even small sandbags. A child would sit, arms at their sides, while the object wobbled precariously above. If it fell, the punishment was swift: extra linens, loss of playtime, or worse, a sharp strike with the cane. The irony, of course, is that these same children often laboured at home, hauling water, tending fires, carrying siblings. Their backs were already bent beneath work and weariness. Yet in school they were expected to mimic statues, as though childhood itself could be sculpted into obedience. And yet, amidst the rigidity, children found ways to resist. Some would balance the book just so, pretending effort while actually leaning slightly to rest tired spines. Others whispered jokes about being wooden soldiers, their stiff arms and straight backs compared to toy figurines lined on mantels. Even in silence, rebellion flickered in the corners of their eyes. Posture discipline was not only about order, it was about control. To command the body was to command the will. A child who sat still was easier to silence, easier to teach, easier to shape into the mould of Victorian respectability. But picture the release at day's end. The straps untied, the books lifted from heads, the boards set aside. Children tumbled into the streets, backs bending freely at last. They ran, they shouted, their laughter rising above rooftops. For in those moments posture no longer mattered. Their spines curved as they pleased, their bodies once more their own. And so, as we watch them scatter into alleys and fields, let us follow the thread of discipline to another curious punishment. Not of silence, not of posture, but of speech itself. For in some classrooms, children were forced to carry tokens of shame, passing them hand to hand whenever they broke the sacred rule of quiet. The books slide from children's heads, their spines at last bending freely as they run into the streets. But when the next morning comes, the discipline begins again. In some schools, the silence medal was not enough. Instead, the punishment of noise was made visible, handed from child to child like a hot coal. It was called the token of shame. Imagine a classroom in 1871, the gas lamps faintly hissing, children seated on wooden benches. The teacher holds a small object, sometimes a wooden block, sometimes a paddle, sometimes a carved token with words scratched into its surface. Upon it might be written a single word: talker. At the day's beginning, the teacher announces, "Whoever speaks out of turn shall carry the token." It is placed first upon one child's desk, the unlucky chosen. The boy or girl flushes red, their peers staring, some smirking, others whispering behind hands. The rule is simple. If another child dares to whisper, to giggle, to mutter, the token is passed on. In this way, it travels through the room, a wandering symbol of disgrace. Children dread its arrival, shifting nervously whenever laughter threatens to escape. Picture a small girl suppressing a cough, her body trembling with the effort. At last the sound bursts forth, and instantly the token is thrust into her hand. Her cheeks burn, her eyes fall to the desk. She did not speak for mischief, she only breathed. But now she is marked. The token is not heavy, yet it weighs on the spirit. It is displayed openly, placed atop a desk where all can see. Sometimes the bearer is denied playtime, or given extra lines to write, or required to sit in the corner, the token on their lap. But the true punishment is the shame itself. The silent judgment of classmates, the sting of being singled out. Children learned quickly to police each other. When one whispered, others hissed, "Quiet, or you'll get the token." In this way, the punishment spread its reach, making enforcers of the children themselves. The classroom became a theatre of self-surveillance, a tiny society where silence was law, and the token its badge of dishonour. And yet, as with all punishments, there were moments of defiance. Some children passed the token with exaggerated ceremony, bowing low as though gifting a crown. Others scribbled tiny faces upon it, turning shame into comedy. A few even whispered deliberately, eager to take the token and mock its power. In these small rebellions, the heavy silence cracked. Still, the token remained a symbol of Victorian schooling's curious obsession to make even the smallest lapse visible, to turn natural chatter into a mark of sin. It was not enough to correct behaviour privately. It had to be displayed, paraded, woven into the daily rhythm of fear and obedience. Imagine the end of the day, when the teacher at last collects the token. The children exhale, relief washing through the room. But tomorrow it will return, waiting for another small slip of laughter, another cough, another whisper. The cycle will begin again. And so, as the token is locked away for the night, its silence heavy with the echoes of shamed children, we turn toward yet another punishment. This time not a medal or a token, but a chair. A place where restless bodies were forced into stillness, where the fidgeting of childhood was trapped beneath the gaze of the master. The token of shame is locked away, its carved surface dark with the memory of restless whispers. But the Victorian classroom had many tools for curbing the energy of children, and one of the strangest was not an object passed hand to hand, it was a chair. Imagine a room in 1868. its walls lined with chalkboards, its floorboards creaking with every movement. In the corner stands a single wooden chair, higher than the others, set apart like a stage. It is plain, unpainted, with a straight back that offers no comfort. This is the punishment chair. A child who fidgets, whispers, or fails to sit properly is marched toward it under the gaze of all. The scrape of the chair's legs echoes as it is dragged into position. The child climbs up, perches stiffly, and sits in silence while the class resumes. The message is clear. To move, to wriggle, to act as a child is to be displayed like a specimen for all to see. Picture a young boy, restless from hunger, his stomach growling softly. He has shifted once too often, tapping his foot, leaning on his elbow. With a sharp command, he is sent to the chair. His cheeks flush as he climbs, the eyes of his classmates prickling at his back. He sits, his feet barely touching the floor, his hands folded tightly to keep from trembling. Some schools called it the dunce chair, though more often that term belonged to the infamous dunce cap. Here, no cap was required. The isolation was punishment enough. Hours could pass with the child seated, the ache in his legs deepening, the shame pressing heavier than the wood beneath him. For teachers, the chair was efficient. It left no mark, no bruise. It turned discipline into theatre, a visible example of what disobedience earned. But for children, it was a kind of exile. They sat apart, forbidden to join in lessons, their minds wandering while shame grew in their hearts. And yet, children being children, even punishment chairs became sites of small rebellion. Some etched initials into the wood, scratching tiny letters with chalk or nails. Others carved faces, leaving behind silent witnesses for the next unlucky occupant. And sometimes, when no one looked, they wriggled or pulled faces at their classmates, trading laughter for punishment's sting. The chair stood not only in classrooms but sometimes in corridors, where children sat in view of passing teachers and pupils. There the humiliation was doubled, on display not just to one class, but to the entire school. Imagine now the end of a long day. The boy climbs down, his legs stiff, his spirit sore. Yet when he rejoins his classmates, a friend offers a quick smile, a whispered joke. The sting fades, replaced by the warmth of camaraderie. Even punishment could not erase the bonds of childhood. The chair, in its silence, embodied much of Victorian schooling, control over body, mind and spirit, enforced through visibility and shame. It was not always harsh in pain, but it was heavy in symbolism, and so, as the chair is pushed back into its corner, ready for the next day's lesson in stillness, we turn toward another strange practice of discipline. This one did not involve chairs or tokens, but the weight of repetition, lines upon lines written until hands cramped, words hammered into memory by sheer force of endurance. The punishment chair creaks as it is pushed back into the corner, silent and waiting for the next restless body. But not all discipline in Victorian schools relied on isolation. Sometimes the punishment was not about sitting still, but about writing again and again until the hand cramped and the slate was filled. Imagine a classroom in 1873. The desks are narrow, the air sharp with the scent of ink. Children sit with quills and slates, their hands stained with smudges. On the master's desk lies a pile of written punishments, slates covered in identical phrases, scratched out in shaky handwriting. This is the punishment of lines. A child caught whispering might be told to write, "I must not talk in class," 50 times. Another caught slouching, "I will sit up straight." A boy who forgot his sums, "Idleness is the enemy of learning." Again and again the chalk squeaks against the slate. The words blur into nothing, a rhythm of repetition that punishes body more than mind. Picture a young girl, her hair falling into her eyes, her fingers stiff from cold. She grips a piece of chalk and scratches out the same sentence for what feels like hours. Her wrist aches, her back tightens. The slate grows crowded with pale letters, so faintly similar they begin to overlap. When the slate fills, she must wipe it clean with a rag, only to begin again. For teachers, lines were useful. They filled silence with work, kept restless hands occupied, and reinforced rules through sheer monotony. But for children, the punishment was drudgery. The repetition dulled thought, turning language into noise, making the phrase lose meaning until it was only chalk dust and fatigue. And yet, even here, children found ways to resist. Some wrote faster, sloppier, filling lines with squiggles that passed for words. Others copied from classmates, sharing chalk and sly smiles. A few wrote their own hidden messages between the lines, tiny jokes, secret initials, like rebellion whispered in chalk. Imagine now the room at dusk, candles flickering low. Children are bent over their desks, their hands trembling with exhaustion. The sound is steady. Scratch, wipe, scratch again. The master watches with satisfaction, seeing order where the children feel only weariness. At last, the day ends. The slates are cleaned, the rags heavy with chalk. Children leave with aching wrists, the punishment carried not in bruises but in sore fingers, and the dull echo of repeated words still ringing in their minds. The punishment of lines captures something essential about Victorian discipline, not always cruel in the obvious sense, but relentless in its demand for obedience. It turned even writing, the act of learning, into a burden, stripping it of joy, pressing it into the shape of a cage. And yet, picture the street outside, where free children run and laugh, their arms swinging wildly, their sore fingers forgotten in the rush of play. For no punishment, however tedious, could fully cage the spirit of youth. And so, as the last scraps of chalk dust settle on the classroom floor, we drift into the next curious corner of discipline, one that returned again to the body itself. For in some schools, the cane was not the only tool of pain. There were rulers, straps, and even the sting of knuckles wrapped against hard wood. The chalk dust of endless lines fades from the air, but in its place comes a sharper sound, one that echoed through countless Victorian schoolrooms. The sharp crack of wood against skin, the hiss of leather through the air. These were the punishments of rulers and straps, swift and stinging, meant to leave not scars but lessons. Imagine a classroom in 1867. The teacher's desk holds not only books and papers, but also tools of discipline. A heavy wooden ruler, its edge polished smooth from years of use, and a leather strap, worn dark at the ends. These were as much part of the school as slates and chalk. Picture a boy caught daydreaming, his eyes drifting to the window where sunlight dances on the cobblestones outside. The teacher's shadow looms, the ruler raised high. Crack! It strikes across the boy's knuckles. His hand jerks back, his eyes fill with tears, but he dares not cry out. To do so would invite further punishment. The room falls silent, every child's gaze fixed nervously on their own desks. The strap was harsher still. Held in the teacher's hand, it could be brought down across palms or even bare legs. The sting was sharp, leaving red welts that faded slowly. Sometimes the child was told to hold out both hands, palms up, while the strap landed again and again. The humiliation was as heavy as the pain, everyone watching, everyone listening to the sound of leather striking flesh. For teachers, these punishments were considered fair, even measured. They were swifter than locking a child in a chair, more direct than endless lines. A single sting, it was thought, could correct hours of mischief. But for the children, the memory of pain lingered longer than the lesson. And yet even here, small rebellions stirred. Children learned to rub their hands quickly against clothing to ease the sting, or to hide their welts under sleeves. Some even compared their marks in secret, holding out reddened palms like trophies, boasting of who had endured the hardest strike. In their whispers, the authority of the strap was lessened, turned into something they could laugh about when the master was gone. The ruler and strap lived in every corner of the classroom. Sometimes they were hung in plain sight, a warning to restless eyes. Sometimes they lay hidden in drawers, their presence known even in absence. Either way, their weight pressed on the children, a constant reminder that disobedience would not only shame but sting. But imagine the schoolyard after dismissal. Children run, their hands still smarting, their laughter louder than the memory of the ruler's crack. They slap palms in play, ignoring the faint ache. They swing arms freely, the strap forgotten in the rush of freedom. For no punishment, however sharp, could fully erase the joy of escape at day's end. The rap of the ruler, the sting of the strap, these were the rhythms of Victorian classrooms, as familiar as the scratch of chalk. They were meant to carve discipline into flesh and memory, yet in truth, they revealed more about the adults who wielded them than the children who endured them. And so, as the ruler is placed back upon the desk, and the strap hung once more on its hook, we move onward to another kind of punishment, one that did not sting the hands but weighed heavily on pride. For some schools revived an ancient symbol of disgrace, the tall pointed dunce cap. The ruler is set down, the strap hangs silent on its hook, but in some schools another punishment waits, a symbol as tall as it was humiliating, the dunce cap. Imagine a classroom in 1859. The air is damp, the windows fogged with children's breath. On a shelf above the teacher's desk rests a pointed hat, made of stiff paper or card, sometimes painted white, sometimes scrawled with bold black letters, dunce. It sits in plain sight, a warning to all who dare to falter. A child who fails to answer a question, who stumbles in reading, or who dares to speak out of turn, is called forward. The teacher lifts the cap with ceremony, placing it upon the child's head. Laughter ripples through the class, stifled quickly when the teacher's eyes sweep the room. The child's face burns, their ears reddening beneath the tall cone. Picture a boy struggling with multiplication, his slate filled with smudges and wrong answers. The teacher frowns, raises the cap, and places it firmly upon his head. He is sent to sit upon the punishment chair, the word dunce towering above him like a cruel banner. He can see only the floor. He dares not raise his eyes to meet the stares of his classmates. The dunce cap was meant not to hurt the body, but to break pride. To be called a dunce was to be declared foolish, incapable, a failure. In a society that prized learning as the path to respectability, this was no small wound. The cap turned the child into a spectacle, a living lesson for others. This is what happens when you fail. And yet, for all its weight, the punishment often missed its mark. Children whispered jokes behind the teacher's back, mocking the tall hat. Some even wore it with exaggerated pride, crossing their arms and grinning defiantly, turning humiliation into theatre. Others decorated it secretly, scratching initials or doodles onto the paper, leaving behind small rebellions for the next unlucky wearer. But not all children found such courage. For many, the memory of the dunce cap lingered long after the day ended. Some carried the shame into adulthood, remembering vividly the heat of that tall hat, the laughter of classmates, the heavy words stamped on their identity. In time, critics began to question the dunce cap. Was it truly teaching or only wounding? By the late Victorian years, it began to fade from many classrooms, replaced by other methods of discipline. Yet its legend endured, passed down in stories, remembered in illustrations, whispered in cautionary tales. Imagine the classroom at day's end. The cap is placed back on its shelf, its tip bent slightly from use, its letters smudged. Children rush out into the streets, laughter spilling freely once more. But the boy who wore it lingers behind, walking slowly, his head bowed. In his mind, the hat is still there, tall and heavy, even as the street swallows him in noise. The dunce cap reveals much about Victorian schooling. It was not only about silence, stillness, or obedience. It was about shame, public, visible, unforgettable. For in the eyes of many teachers, shame was as powerful a tool as the cane. And so, as the classroom grows dark and the dunce cap waits silently on its shelf for another day, we move forward to punishments that reach beyond hats and chairs into the very heart of childhood play. For even the joy of games and recess could be taken away, turned into another lesson in obedience. The tall dunce cap is set back on its shelf, its letters still bold, its shame still heavy. But not every punishment in Victorian schools required props or pain. Sometimes it was enough to strip children of the one thing that gave them joy, their play. Imagine a schoolyard in 1871. The bell rings, its metal clang echoing across the cobblestones. Children burst from the doors, their feet flying, their voices rising in shrieks of laughter. The yard comes alive with games. Skipping ropes snapping against the ground, marbles clattering, hoops rolling, boys chasing one another in wild circles. For a moment, the school is transformed from discipline to freedom. But not for all. Along the wall stand several children, hands clasped, faces long. They have been denied recess. While their classmates run and play, they remain still, their bodies aching to join. The punishment is not physical pain, but deprivation, watching joy while being forbidden to touch it. Picture a girl who forgot her copybook at home. She begged her mother to search, but it could not be found. The next day she is told she will not play at recess. She stands against the wall, her shawl pulled tight, as her friends laugh and skip rope before her. The minutes stretch endlessly, each shout of laughter piercing deeper than any cane. Some children were made to sit indoors during playtime, staring at slates or copying lines, while others enjoyed the open air. The windows rattled with the sound of games outside, the contrast sharpening the punishment. The air inside felt heavy, stale compared to the freedom just beyond the glass. Teachers believed this punishment to be gentle, even merciful. It left no bruises, no tears of physical pain, and yet for children it could be the cruelest of all. Play was their release, their chance to move, laugh, and feel alive after long hours of stillness. To lose it was to lose a piece of themselves. And yet, even here, rebellion stirred. Some children winked to their punished friends, tossing marbles or pebbles close enough to be nudged discreetly. Others whispered jokes during lessons, offering comfort in small ways. Sometimes, when the master's back was turned, the punished ones slipped briefly into the game, darting back to the wall before they could be noticed. These little acts of defiance softened the sting, reminding them they were not truly cut off. But still the lesson was clear, joy was conditional. Freedom was a privilege, not a right. A single mistake could strip it away, and so children learned to guard their play as carefully as their silence, to fear the loss of laughter as much as the sting of the cane. Imagine now the yard at day's end. The games fade, the ropes are tucked away, the marbles pocketed. The punished children walk home in silence, their bodies heavy with the ache of absence. The memory of lost play lingers long, sharper than lines, deeper than straps. For childhood thrives on joy, and to take it away was to cut at the root of their spirit. In the Victorian classroom, punishments touched every corner of life. Speech, posture, hands, pride, even the freedom of play. Nothing was beyond the reach of discipline, and yet, even in the strictest schools, one form of punishment struck deeper still, silence not as a medal nor as a token, but as exile. For some children were sent away from their peers, isolated in corners, shadows, or even dark closets, their punishment solitude itself. The sound of laughter fades from the schoolyard, ropes coiled, marbles pocketed, and the punished children walk home heavy with silence. But some punishments went further still, not only denying play, but denying presence itself. In the Victorian schoolroom, a child could be made invisible, banished from the life of the class, exiled to corners or closets where only solitude kept company. Imagine a classroom in 1864. The benches creak under rows of restless bodies, chalk squeaks faintly across the board, and in the farthest corner, apart from all others, sits a single child. Their desk has been dragged there deliberately, angled away, facing the wall. The lesson goes on, voices rise and fall, but for this child there is only silence and the grain of wood before their eyes. Teachers called it standing out or corner duty. A child who whispered, laughed, or stumbled in recitation could be ordered there instantly. The corner was both prison and theatre, public enough that all could see the shame, private enough that no one could offer comfort. Hours could stretch endlessly, the wall closing in, the weight of solitude pressing heavier than any cane. Sometimes the punishment was harsher still. A child might be made to stand, nose nearly touching the wall, arms at their sides, forbidden to move. The minutes dragged, feet numb, shoulders aching. Even the hum of the classroom felt distant, as though the child were cut away from the world. And in some schools, the isolation was darker, literally. Small cupboards or storage closets were used as punishment cells. Children shut inside, the air close and musty, the dark pressing down. Imagine the fear of a 7-year-old alone in the dark, the scrape of the door echoing in their ears. For teachers it was discipline. For children it was terror. Isolation carried humiliation as well as fear. To be set apart was to be declared unworthy, unwanted, less than one's peers. It was a punishment not of pain but of identity, stripping a child from the group and stamping them as outcast. And yet, even here, small sparks of rebellion glowed. Some children carved initials into walls, leaving secret messages for the next exile. Others whispered jokes when they returned, turning the corner into legend. "Did you know I counted 67 cracks in the wall?" Their stories softened the sting, turned terror into shared humor, but the truth lingered. For many, the memory of exile remained sharper than straps or rulers. To be left out, unseen, forgotten even briefly, it cut deeper than pain. It told them they were alone, that their voices could be erased. Imagine now the schoolhouse after dismissal. The corner stands empty, the closet door ajar. Dust motes drift in the fading light, as though the air remembers the breath of those once trapped within. Children's laughter fades down the lane, but in the silent room the corner waits, ready for another child to bear its loneliness. Isolation was disciplined by absence, a punishment that taught not through sting but through silence. It revealed the Victorian obsession not just with control of bodies, but with control of belonging itself. For to exile a child was to teach them that even community, even childhood friendship, was conditional upon obedience. And so, as the shadows stretch across the classroom floor, let us step gently toward another strange practice of schooling. This one carried less fear, but more spectacle. A punishment not of corners or closets, but of standing tall with weights and burdens, as though discipline itself could be measured in how long a child could hold up their arms. The corner lies empty, the dark cupboard closed for the night. But the Victorian classroom had endless ways to bend children into discipline, and one of the more curious was not about silence nor shame, but endurance. It was the punishment of weights, making children hold their arms outstretched, sometimes with books, sometimes with sandbags, until their small muscles trembled with fatigue. Imagine a schoolroom in 1875. The master's voice booms across the rows of benches. "Stand and hold out your arms." A boy rises, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His classmates glance nervously, glad it is not them. His arms extend straight before him, palms flat, fingers trembling slightly. At first it seems easy, almost silly, like pretending to fly, but minutes pass and the ache begins to creep into his shoulders. Now the teacher adds weight. A thick book, its leather cover worn, is placed in one hand, another in the other. The boy sways, fighting to keep balance. The books grow heavier by the second, though they have not changed. His cheeks flush, his body quivers. Behind him, whispers stir, half sympathy, half curiosity. Picture the scene, a row of children, punished together, each with arms extended, books balanced like burdens. Their faces tighten, their breaths grow shallow, but none dare lower their arms. For the rule is clear, if the arms drop, the punishment is doubled. The classroom fills with silence, broken only by the soft creak of strained muscles. It is a peculiar sight, almost absurd. Small bodies transformed into statues, bearing invisible crosses of endurance. The punishment leaves no mark, no welt, yet it sears itself into memory through sheer exhaustion. Teachers believed this exercise built discipline. It taught obedience, strengthened bodies, and broke willful spirits without resorting to cane or strap. But for children, it was torment disguised as lesson. Each second dragged like an hour. Each flutter of muscle felt like betrayal, and yet, as always, small rebellions flickered. Some children whispered jokes about being soldiers, arms out like rifles. Others cheated slightly, resting books on fingertips rather than palms, shifting weight in tiny, daring movements. A few, when finally released, shook their arms dramatically, pulling faces to make classmates laugh. Even pain could be turned into comedy once freedom returned. Imagine the end of punishment. The teacher at last nods, the arms fall limp, the books slam onto desks with relief. Fingers flex, shoulders roll, laughter bubbles softly despite stern warnings. The children have endured, and in their shared suffering a bond forms, an unspoken camaraderie born of aching muscles. The punishment of weights reveals something essential about Victorian discipline. It sought to control not only words and thoughts, but the very body itself. Stillness, silence, endurance. These were virtues carved into children as surely as their lessons in Latin or arithmetic. And so, as the classroom settles once more, the books stacked neatly, the arms lowered and sore, we move toward another form of discipline. One that did not weigh on shoulders, but on time itself. Detentions that stretched into long hours, keeping children penned within walls when freedom lay just beyond the door. The aching arms have fallen, the heavy books stacked once more upon the desk. But Victorian discipline was not finished with the day's lessons. Sometimes the punishment was not pain, nor shame, nor weight upon the body. It was weight upon time. Hours stretched into cages, freedom stolen by the simplest decree. Detention. Imagine a schoolhouse in 1878. The bell tolls, sharp and clear, calling an end to lessons. Children leap from their benches, laughter bursting forth like a spring released. They pour into the streets, feet pounding cobblestones, voices rising in songs of play. But not all. A few remain behind, their shoulders heavy, their eyes fixed on the floor. They have been sentenced to stay, detained. The classroom, once lively, grows cavernous in silence. The punished children sit at their desks, slates before them, the master pacing slowly between rows. Outside the windows, the sounds of freedom taunt them, the thud of hoops rolling, the clatter of marbles, the shrill joy of skipping ropes. Each sound pierces deeper than any strap, for to be held inside while laughter rings outside is punishment sharpened by longing. Picture a girl with ink-stained fingers copying lines for the 100th time. Idleness is sin. Idleness is sin. Her wrist aches, her eyes blur, yet she writes on. Across the room, a boy stares blankly at his slate, too tired to think, too bitter to work. The master's cane taps against the desk, sharp, rhythmic, unyielding. The minutes crawl, each one stretching into eternity. Detention often meant more than writing. Sometimes children were ordered to clean classrooms, scrubbing floors until knees ached, or to wash slates, polish desks, fetch water. The tasks were dull, thankless, endless. To serve detention was to give labour as penance. And yet, like all punishments, children learned to soften it with rebellion. Some whispered to each other when the master's back was turned, sharing jokes that made even the dullest hours lighter. Others turned their copied lines into games, hiding tiny drawings between words. A few found comfort in the silence itself, enjoying a rare break from the chaos of crowded lessons. But for most, detention was pure loss. It stole from them what little joy the day offered. Playtime was not just leisure. It was escape, movement, release. To be denied, it was to carry the weight of school even into evening, to arrive home weary, too tired to laugh with siblings or help with chores. Imagine the release at last, the dismissal whispered like a blessing. You may go. Children rise stiffly, gathering slates and rags, stepping into the twilight with hearts still heavy. The streets are quieter now, the best of play has already passed. They walk home slowly, time stolen, the memory of freedom withheld sharper than the cane's sting. Detention was discipline made of absence of joy, absence of freedom, absence of light. It was a punishment that echoed long after its hours ended, reminding children that every moment of laughter could be snatched away. And so, as we watch the last child slip into the evening fog, her hands still ink-stained from endless lines, we drift toward another strange corner of punishment. This one left no mark on the hands or back, nor did it steal time. Instead, it marked the child in the eyes of all, a spectacle of mockery, where shame was worn not on the body, but on the head, in the form of ridiculous caps and costumes designed to turn disobedience into comedy. The long hours of detention fade, the ink-stained slates left to dry, but Victorian teachers had other ways of disciplining children, ways that did not sting the hands or weigh down the body, but instead struck at dignity itself. Shame, after all, could be dressed up and paraded, turned into spectacle, and so came the punishment of caps and costumes. Imagine a schoolroom in 1862. The benches are crowded, the air damp with coal smoke, and on a hook behind the teacher's desk hangs not only the dreaded strap, but a tall floppy cap. Sometimes it was pointed like the dunce cap, sometimes wide-brimmed and ridiculous, but always absurd. Upon it letters might be scrawled, "Fool, idler, liar." A child caught whispering too much or fidgeting or failing a recitation might be called forward. The cap is lowered onto their head, heavy not with weight but with ridicule. Giggles ripple through the class, hastily stifled when the master's gaze sharpens. The punished child burns with embarrassment, their ears hot beneath the fabric, their pride sagging beneath the mockery. Picture a boy made to wear a paper collar scrawled with the words, "I talk too much." He's ordered to stand in front of the class, arms folded, while lessons continue. His classmates sneak glances, biting lips to hold back laughter. He feels small, silly, humiliated. The punishment is not pain but theatre, a performance of disgrace staged for all to see. Some schools took this further. Children might be forced to wear donkey ears made of card, or to hold wooden signs proclaiming their faults. A girl who stumbled in arithmetic might hold a placard reading, "I am a slow learner." A boy who misbehaved might wear a necklace of wooden spoons, each clattering as he walked, drawing attention to his shame. To Victorian teachers, such punishments seemed clever, teaching through laughter, turning ridicule into memory. But for the children, they cut deep. To be laughed at by one's peers was a wound that lingered long after the cap was removed. Shame, once planted, grew quickly in young hearts, and yet even here rebellion flickered. Some children wore the costumes with exaggerated pride, strutting as though the donkey ears were a crown. Others turned mockery into camaraderie, whispering encouragement to the punished, or pulling faces behind the teacher's back to make them laugh. A few even found humour in it themselves, shrugging off shame with a grin once the ordeal was over. Still, the punishment revealed much of Victorian schooling. It was not enough to correct behaviour quietly. It had to be made visible, public, unforgettable. The child became a lesson, their body a blackboard upon which ridicule was written. Imagine the end of the day. The cap is returned to its hook, floppy and worn from use, its letters smudged but still legible. The punished child walks home, head lowered, the echo of laughter still ringing in their ears. Even as the street swallows them, the memory clings, heavy as the cap itself. Punishments like these show us how Victorian classrooms blurred the line between discipline and theatre. Children were not only taught lessons of reading and sums, but also lessons of shame, endurance, and silence. And so, as the fool's cap rests in its corner, waiting for another head to bear its weight of mockery, we move toward the next form of punishment. One that required no props, no straps, no costumes, only the voice of the teacher, raised sharp and loud, echoing through the classroom walls like a storm. The fool's cap is set back upon its hook, floppy and worn, its letters faded with time. Yet not all punishments in Victorian schools required props or straps. Sometimes the sharpest sting came not from wood or leather, but from words. A teacher's voice, raised and cutting, could strike deeper than the cane. Imagine a schoolroom in 1870. The air is thick with coal dust. Children's slates clatter softly, and then, suddenly, the master's voice booms across the room. "Foolish boy. Do you call that an answer?" The child shrinks in his seat, cheeks burning, ears ringing. The lesson halts. All eyes turn toward him. He has made an example, not with blows, but with scorn. Scolding was a weapon sharpened by repetition. Teachers knew how to make words heavy, how to twist a simple mistake into a failing of character. A child who stumbled over spelling might be called lazy. One who fidgeted might be told they had no sense at all. These words stuck like thorns, carried home, carried into sleep, carried sometimes for years. Picture a girl, her voice trembling as she reads aloud. She mispronounces a word and the teacher's scolding crashes down. "Stupid child, haven't you been listening?" Laughter ripples among classmates, not from cruelty but from fear. They laugh so as not to be next. The girl swallows hard, her eyes blur with tears, but she forces herself to continue. Each syllable feels like walking barefoot on stones. Scolding was often paired with spectacle. A child might be made to stand while the teacher's voice rained upon them, or even paraded before the class. "This is what idleness looks like," the teacher would thunder, pointing as though the child were not human but object. For some teachers, the voice replaced the cane. They boasted that words were better than blows, that shame could do what pain could not. But for children, the wounds were invisible and lasting. A bruise faded in days. A word like fool, once planted, could bloom in memory for a lifetime. And yet, children being children, they found ways to soften even this. Some rolled their eyes in secret, mocking the master's dramatic tones. Others whispered imitations later, mimicking every phrase, turning fear into comedy. Laughter shared in alleys or fields after school became its own balm, a way to reclaim power stolen by scorn. But not all children escaped so lightly. For some, scolding carved deep lines of shame, shaping how they saw themselves long after school had ended. They remembered the echo of harsh voices more vividly than any lesson of sums or grammar. Imagine now the classroom at dusk, quiet at last. The scolding has ended, the walls no longer ring with angry echoes, but the silence feels heavy, as though the words still hang in the air, invisible but sharp. A child lingers in memory, replaying the sound again and again, as if the voice was still chasing them home. The Victorian schoolroom shows us this truth. Discipline was as much about sound as silence, about words as much as actions. The teacher's voice was not only instruction, it was authority, control, punishment. And so, as we leave the echoing scold behind, we step into another peculiar practice. Punishments that reached into the home, binding parents and children alike in the web of discipline. For sometimes, the school did not end with its walls. Punishment followed into households, where parents were made to share in the shame of their children. The master's scolding fades, the echoes still humming against the old plaster walls. Yet, in many Victorian schools, punishment was not finished when the bell rang. The walls of the classroom were not enough to contain it. Instead, discipline spilled out into the cobbled streets, into kitchens and parlours, into the very heart of children's homes. Imagine a boy in 1876 standing small at the front of the class. He has failed to recite his lesson, stumbling over Latin verbs. The teacher does not beat him, nor does he make him wear the dunce cap. Instead, the punishment is more enduring. He's given a written note, folded neatly, addressed to his parents. He must carry it home, hand it over with trembling fingers, and face a second trial. The note might read, "Your son has been lazy. He has failed in his duties. Correct him, or he will never learn." The teacher's voice is not just his own anymore. It echoes through the authority of the household. The punishment continues by proxy. Picture the boy walking home, the note heavy in his pocket, heavier than any book. The streets are alive with other children's laughter, but he cannot join. He imagines his father's frown, his mother's sigh, the possibility of further punishment. Perhaps a strap, perhaps a lecture, perhaps a meal withheld. Every step is shadowed by the weight of paper. Sometimes, the punishment was visible without a note. Children were sent home wearing signs or marks, forced to parade their shame through the streets. A smudge of ink on the forehead, a paper badge pinned to clothing, a chalk word scrawled across a coat. Idle, fool, disobedient. Passers-by would glance, neighbours would whisper, and the humiliation spread beyond the classroom walls. For Victorian parents, the teacher's word carried immense authority. To challenge it was rare, to enforce it was expected, and so the punishments multiplied. School discipline followed by household discipline, one feeding into the other, doubling the weight borne by children. And yet, in some homes, rebellion softened the blow. A kind mother might hide the note, crumpling it before the father returned. An older sibling might tease the punished child, but then share sweets or stories to make them smile again. In certain families, the teacher's authority ended at the doorstep, and the child's shame was quietly brushed away. But in others, the home became a harsher extension of the school. A child already weary from detention might face another round of chores, lectures, or scoldings. Sleep came slowly those nights, burdened by the feeling that punishment had no end. Imagine now the boy at his supper table. The note has been read, the lecture delivered, perhaps even a strap across his knuckles. The food before him tastes of ashes, the air heavy with disappointment. He longs for morning to come, for school to begin again, not because he loves it, but because at least there, the punishment has already been endured. This extension of punishment into the home shows us how tightly Victorian society bound children. Discipline was not confined to one place. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. To be a child was to live under watchful eyes, in classrooms and kitchens alike, where mistakes were never private and shame could follow you across thresholds. And so, as the candle burns low in that weary household and the note is tucked away into a drawer, we drift into another curious corner of discipline. This one was neither written nor spoken, neither scold nor strap. Instead, it was about posture, about shaping the body into obedience, punishments that demanded stillness and form, turning children into rigid statues of supposed virtue. The note to the parents has been folded, read, and tucked away, its weight still lingering in the child's heart. But in some Victorian classrooms, punishment was not about notes nor about straps, but about the very shape of the body. Posture in that era was considered not just politeness, but morality. A child who slouched was not merely untidy, they were thought to be morally weak. And so, punishment took on the form of sculpting bodies into statues. Imagine a schoolroom in 1869. The master strides between desks, cane in hand, eyes sharp as pins. A boy is leaning lazily, his chin resting on his palm. At once the master halts. "Stand, sir. Stand and show us your strength." The boy is pulled from his seat, placed at the front of the class. His punishment is simple yet exhausting. He must stand perfectly straight, back against the wall, arms at his sides, eyes forward, without movement, without relief. At first it seems harmless. No blow, no strap. But minutes stretch into half an hour. The boy's legs ache, his shoulders burn, his eyes water with the effort of stillness. His classmates glance at him, some pitying, some amused. He dares not move, for the master's cane taps against the desk in slow rhythm, a warning that every twitch will be noticed. Picture a girl punished not for slouching but for writing too slowly. She is made to balance a book upon her head as she sits, the weight pressing down, forcing her spine into rigidity. Each time it wobbles, the teacher's voice cuts across the room. "Straighten." The book becomes an unyielding crown, her body an unwilling throne. By the end, her neck aches, her shoulders throb, yet she has not dared to let it fall. Sometimes posture punishments grew harsher still. Children were ordered to kneel upon the hard wooden floor, hands folded tightly, eyes fixed on a single spot. The minutes dragged, the boards dug into their knees, and silence pressed down heavier than any cane. This posture of piety was meant to teach humility, as though stillness itself could carve virtue into young souls. And yet, even in stillness, children found rebellion. Some counted quietly in their heads, turning minutes into numbers. Others imagined they were soldiers standing to attention, or statues admired in grand halls. A few even swayed imperceptibly, just enough to ease the ache, daring the master's watchful eye. But for many, the punishment worked as intended. They remembered not only the pain of aching limbs, but the humiliation of being forced into rigidity, like puppets held upright by invisible strings. Posture became a burden, something carried even outside the classroom, where slouching felt like guilt and straightness felt like fear. Imagine now the end of the day. The children shuffle from the schoolroom, some with knees sore, others with stiff backs. Their play in the streets is freer than ever, arms flung wide, spines bending with laughter, bodies reclaiming the right to move. The punishment lingers, but so does the relief of motion, sweeter for being denied. The posture punishments of Victorian schools remind us how discipline reached even into the smallest details of a child's body. Silence, stillness, straightness. These were not only rules, but ideals, drilled into flesh as surely as sums into slates. And so, as we leave behind the image of children standing rigid as statues beneath flickering gaslight, we turn to another peculiar form of discipline, one that relied less on the body and more on the air itself. The punishment of enforced silence, not with medals or notes, but with long, unbroken hours of wordless obedience. The rigid statues of posture are finally released, their spines aching, their shoulders sore. Children spill into the streets, bending and twisting as though reclaiming the joy of movement. But the Victorian schoolroom was not always about bending bodies into obedience. Sometimes the punishment was about stilling the tongue, silencing the very breath of chatter. It was the discipline of silence. Imagine a schoolhouse in 1872 lit dimly by the weak afternoon sun. The master raises a finger and the room stills. A child who has whispered too many times or giggled during recitation is singled out. The punishment is simple yet crushing. They're to remain utterly silent, not for a few minutes, but for an hour, or even an entire day. At first, the silence feels light, almost easy. The child sits stiffly at their bench, biting their tongue when a thought rises. But as time stretches, the silence grows heavy, suffocating. The urge to whisper a joke, to ask a question, to simply say anything becomes unbearable. Words press against their lips like water against a dam desperate to flow. Some schools use silence medals or tokens, heavy discs hung around the neck as public reminders. This child must not speak. Each time the child tried to open their mouth, the medal gleamed, a warning to all. Imagine the humiliation of wearing such a sign, your silence turned into spectacle, your voice chained by a piece of brass. Picture a girl punished for giggling during hymn practice. She is made to sit at the back of the class, hands folded, her silence enforced. When a classmate drops a slate, the room erupts in muffled laughter. She wants to join, to share the moment, but she cannot. Her lips press tight, her body trembles, and tears well in her eyes, not from pain but from exclusion. Teachers prize silence as a virtue. To them it represented obedience, humility, readiness to learn. But for children, silence was exile. It cut them off from friendship, from play, from the very fabric of being young. A day without words was a day half-lived. And yet children being children, they found cracks in the silence. Some scribbled notes to one another on scraps of paper, sliding them across desks with quick, furtive hands. Others communicated with gestures, pointing, miming, rolling eyes in exaggerated expressions. Laughter often broke through, silent but unmistakable, a rebellion of smiles against the weight of enforced quiet. Still, the punishment worked on many. By the end of the day, silence left them weary as though drained of colour. To be robbed of one's voice was to feel invisible, erased even in the midst of a crowded room. Imagine now the release. The master at last dismisses them, lifting the burden of silence. The child bursts into chatter the moment they step outside, words tumbling in a rush, laughter loud and unrestrained. Their voice, bottled all day, explodes into freedom. The street echoes with the joy of sound reclaimed, sweeter for its absence. The Victorian obsession with silence reveals much about their vision of education. Words were power, and so words had to be controlled, measured, rationed. Silence was not only discipline, it was training, teaching children to hold their tongues, to submit their voices to authority. And so, as the schoolroom fades into twilight, the silence medal tucked away once more, we turn to another peculiar punishment. This one did not silence the tongue but bound the body in discomfort, using contraptions as strange as they were cruel, thumb traps, finger stocks, and devices designed to pin down restless hands. The long silence lifts. Voices burst free into the streets, children's chatter ringing like bells against the evening air. But for some unlucky pupils in Victorian schools, punishment came not in the form of lost words or heavy silence, but in the capture of restless hands. To fidget was sin, to tap fingers or chew nails a crime of discipline. And so, ingenious contraptions were devised to still the mischief. Thumb traps, finger stocks, and hand restraints that turned a child's own body into a prison. Imagine a classroom in 1865 lit faintly by a smoky oil lamp. At the master's desk lies a curious object of wood and iron, the finger stock. It looks harmless at first, like two narrow boards joined by hinges. But place a child's hand inside, clamp it shut, and the fingers are trapped, squeezed between unforgiving wood. The child cannot write, cannot fidget. cannot even scratch an itch. Their hand becomes a specimen pinned like an insect. Picture a boy who has tapped his slate one too many times. His teacher, stern and sharp-eyed, summons him forward. With a snap, the stock clamps shut around his hand. He returns to his bench, red-cheeked, as his classmates glance nervously. The lesson continues, but for him time crawls. His hand aches, fingers numb, the pressure constant and humiliating. Every attempt to shift draws a creak of wood and a stern glance from the master. Thumb traps were crueler still. Iron devices, sometimes with small teeth, designed to pinch the thumb and hold it immobile. They were often used for nail-biting or thumb-sucking, habits Victorian teachers viewed not as childish quirks but as moral failings. Imagine the sharp bite of metal against tender skin, the humiliation of sitting through hours of lessons with a thumb painfully clamped on display for all to see. Some schools had stocks large enough for both hands, sometimes even feet. A child locked in such restraints could do nothing but sit and stare, an exhibit of disobedience corrected through immobility. The message was clear. Movement was rebellion, stillness was virtue, and yet even here children found ways to endure. Some wriggled fingers ever so slightly, finding tiny relief in stolen movements. Others whispered jokes, calling the trapped child a knight with gauntlets or a prisoner awaiting rescue. Laughter softened the cruelty, turned humiliation into shared defiance. But for many, the pain and shame lingered. The marks of the stock could press into the skin, leaving red grooves long after release. The memory of helplessness, hands bound, body powerless, etched itself deeper still. The finger stocks and thumb traps reflect something profound about Victorian schooling. They were not just about punishment, they were about control. A restless child was not merely inconvenient, they were seen as morally weak, needing to be bound into obedience. By restraining hands, teachers sought to restrain minds. Imagine now the release at last. The stock creaks open, the child flexes stiff fingers, rubbing warmth back into them. Freedom feels strange, almost unreal. He grips his slate with relief, even joy, though writing still aches. The lesson continues, but his thoughts linger on the trap, its grip still ghostly around his hand. In time, such devices fell out of favour, condemned as cruel relics of an earlier age. Yet their memory remains, a reminder of how far schools went in their quest to tame childhood energy. And so, as the wooden stocks are pushed back beneath the master's desk, their hinges squeaking faintly in the dim light, we step toward another corner of punishment. This one did not rely on devices or silence, but on spectacle once more. Public ridicule staged in front of the entire school, where laughter and shame became the tools of correction. The creak of the fingerstock fades, the child's stiff fingers flexed at last. But Victorian schools had other ways to leave a mark without blows or metal. Some punishments relied not on pain nor on silence, but on shame magnified 100-fold. Shame performed in front of peers, where ridicule itself became the weapon. Imagine a school hall in 1874. The benches are filled, rows upon rows of children waiting for assembly. The headmaster stands at the front, his black gown billowing slightly as he clears his throat. Then, with deliberate slowness, he calls forward a single child. The name echoes in the hall and all eyes turn. The child walks stiffly, every step heavier than the last. At the front, their fault is announced for all to hear. Perhaps they were caught lying or speaking out of turn or failing to complete lessons. Whatever the misdeed, it is no longer private. It is broadcast to the entire school, the words tumbling like stones. The child stands small and exposed, their shame multiplied by the number of watching eyes. Sometimes the punishment was harsher still. A child might be forced to stand on a bench, towering above classmates, while the teacher mocked them openly, or they might wear a placard with their fault written large. Idler, liar, fool, a word that followed them as they walked through the hall. The ridicule was not quiet but staged. Theatre meant to burn humiliation into memory. Picture a girl who failed to recite her geography lesson. She stands trembling, a large sign hung around her neck, ignorant. Laughter ripples across the benches, not because her classmates are cruel, but because laughter is safer than pity. The girl's cheeks burn, Her eyes blur with tears, but she must stand still until the headmaster dismisses her. Teachers believed such public punishments worked doubly. They corrected the guilty and warned the innocent. "See what happens when you are idle," the master would thunder, pointing at the shamed child. The hall would murmur with unease, every child imagining their own turn upon the stage. But humiliation cut deeper than straps or rulers. To be laughed at by peers, to be marked as foolish or wicked before the crowd, was a wound to the heart. It taught not only obedience, but fear of exposure. For many, the memory lingered long after childhood, sharper than the sting of any cane. And yet even here, small resistances lived. Some children whispered comfort afterward, walking home arm in arm with the punished one. Others, when the master was gone, mimicked his booming voice, turning fear into comedy. A few, bold or stubborn, even wore their signs with defiance, crossing arms and grinning, refusing to let ridicule pierce them. Still, the punishment reveals much about Victorian thinking. Discipline was not just about shaping individuals, it was about shaping communities. Public ridicule turned a child's failure into a cautionary tale for all, a living warning that obedience was not optional but survival. Imagine now the end of assembly. The placard is removed, the hall empties in a rush of feet and voices. The punished child lingers behind, shoulders hunched, cheeks still hot with shame. Outside, laughter resumes, but in their ears the echo of the hall lingers, heavy as a stone. Public ridicule shows us how Victorian schools blurred the line between teaching and theatre, punishment and performance. And so, as the echo of the master's voice fades into silence, we turn toward another peculiar punishment, one rooted not in words or shame, but in the very air children breathed. For some schools believed that cold itself could teach discipline, and so children were punished by being sent outdoors into the chill of Victorian winters. The echo of ridicule still lingers in the Great Hall, the placards tucked away until the next unlucky child wears them. Yet not all punishments relied on voices or crowds. Some were quieter, more elemental. They came not from wood or leather, but from the raw bite of nature itself. For in many Victorian schools, the cold was considered a stern teacher. Imagine a damp winter morning in 1881. The air inside the schoolroom is already chilled, breath visible in faint clouds. A child has fidgeted too much or spoken out of turn or failed to complete their lesson. The master does not scold nor reach for the cane. Instead, he gestures to the door. "Out! Stand in the yard until you learn your place." The child steps outside, the heavy wooden door creaking shut behind them. The air is sharp, biting at their cheeks, pricking their fingers. The schoolyard is empty, grey with frost. They stand alone, shivering, while the muffled sound of lessons continues inside. Minutes stretch like hours, the cold seeping through thin boots and threadbare coat. Sometimes children were sent without shawls or caps, their hair damp, their bodies trembling. In harsher schools, they were made to stand barefoot on the cold ground, the sting rising through their souls like fire. The punishment was not to wound, but to chill, to make the body ache with longing for warmth. Picture a boy with ink-stained fingers holding them tight against his chest to keep them from stiffening. Each gust of wind cuts deeper, each moment longer. He shifts from foot to foot, but movement brings little relief. The yard feels vast, the walls high, the sky merciless. For teachers, this punishment was natural. The cold was free, impartial, and left no mark. It was thought to build toughness, to burn idleness away. A little shivering will teach them discipline, some masters said, convinced that discomfort shaped character as surely as recitation shaped memory. But for children, it was misery. Cold crept into bones, stiffened fingers, dulled thought. The body shrank inward, seeking warmth that never came. Humiliation mixed with ache, for classmates inside knew who had been sent out, and sometimes pressed their noses to the glass to glimpse the shivering figure outside. And yet, resilience flickered even here. Some children hummed quietly to themselves, creating warmth through rhythm. Others stomped their feet, pretending they were soldiers on parade. A few carved little shapes into the frost with their shoes, turning punishment into play, however briefly. When at last the door creaked open and the child was allowed back inside, The warmth of the classroom felt like bliss. Even the smell of chalk dust and ink seemed comforting after the bite of frost. The lesson resumed, but their body still trembled, their mind clouded by cold. The punishment lingered long after it ended. The use of cold reveals much about Victorian schooling. Discipline was not only about correcting behaviour, it was about shaping endurance, teaching children to accept discomfort as part of life. Pain, silence, humiliation, cold, each was seen as a step toward obedience and virtue. Imagine now the schoolroom at day's end. The punished child walks home through foggy streets, the chill still in their bones, yet relieved to be free at last. The fire at home feels brighter, the blanket warmer, because of the cold endured. And somewhere in the master's mind, he believes a lesson has been taught. And so, as frost glitters faintly on the windows, we step toward another peculiar punishment, one that blurred the line between discipline and labour. For many Victorian schools believed that chores themselves could correct disobedience, turning punishment into work and work into yet another form of silence. The cold air fades from the child's bones as they step back into the warmth of the classroom. The sting of frost is replaced by the familiar smell of chalk dust and ink. But punishment in Victorian schools was never limited to cane, silence, or even cold. Sometimes it came in the form of labour, chores pressed upon small shoulders, where disobedience was repaid not in blows but in work. Imagine a school in 1877. The lessons have ended, the benches empty, the laughter of children drifts faintly through the yard. Yet one or two pupils remain, their faces drawn with weariness. The master stands sternly at the front, arms crossed. Their punishment is simple. They must work. The tasks vary. One child scrubs the floors, knees pressing into rough boards, rag damp with soap. Each stroke of the cloth spreads water that seeps into clothing, leaving the child chilled and sore. Another polishes desks, the wood smelling of oil, fingers blackened with grime. A third is sent to fetch pails of water from the pump outside, the bucket heavy, the handle cutting into tender hands. Sometimes children were made to wash slates for the whole class, dipping rags into cold water until their fingers numbed. Others carried coal for the stove, staining their hands and clothes with soot. Even sweeping floors was not light work, for the straw brooms were rough and stiff, raising dust that stung eyes and throats. Picture a girl tasked with cleaning the chalkboard. She reaches up again and again, her arm aching, the chalk smearing white streaks across her dress. Each time she steps back, the master shakes his head. Again, cleaner this time. The punishment stretches on, longer than any lesson. For teachers, labour was useful. It corrected disobedience and kept children occupied while also maintaining the school. A disobedient child became, for an hour, a servant of discipline. The punishment was practical and symbolic. Laziness turned into labour, idleness into effort. Yet for children, the chores were bitter. To work when others played felt like exile, a theft of freedom. The rags scraped their skin, the bucket bruised their palms, the dust filled their lungs. Each task was a reminder that their mistake had chained them to drudgery, and still rebellion found its way in. Some children scrubbed half-heartedly, dragging rags just enough to satisfy the master's eye. Others made games of it, racing to see how quickly a task could be done, or leaving secret initials carved into polished desks. A few even found pride in their work, grinning slyly when classmates admired a gleaming surface without knowing whose punishment had created it. But more often, labour left resentment. Children trudged home weary, clothes damp, fingers raw. The work lingered in their bones, not as a lesson in virtue, but as a memory of humiliation. To be forced into chores was to be reminded that their time, their effort, even their strength, belonged not to them, but to authority. Imagine the schoolroom at dusk. The punished child wrings out the last rag, sets aside the bucket, sweeps the final curls of dust into a pile. The master nods curtly, dismissing them with a flick of the hand. They step into the fading light, arms sore, clothes stained, but heart alight with the relief of freedom. The taste of supper, the warmth of home, will feel sweeter because of labour endured. Chores as punishment remind us how Victorian schools blurred the lines between discipline and daily life. Learning, working, serving, they were all threads of the same tapestry, woven tightly until childhood itself felt like labour. And so, as the last broom rests against the wall and the stove crackles faintly with coal carried by small hands, we turn toward another curious punishment. This one had less to do with work and more to do with spectacle, forcing children to parade their shame through imitation and mimicry, made to act as examples for others in ways both cruel and theatrical. The wet rags are wrung, the soot-stained hands washed as best as they can be, and the schoolhouse sinks into quiet. Yet Victorian teachers often sought not only to discipline a child, but to turn them into a living lesson, an exhibit for the rest of the class. And so came a peculiar punishment, theatrical in nature, where the disobedient were made to perform their faults in front of all. Imagine a classroom in 1868. The master's eye is narrowing as he catches a boy whispering jokes during recitation. Instead of the cane or corner, the teacher claps his hands sharply. "Stand up and show the class exactly what you are doing." The boy hesitates, face flushing. "Do it. Let them see your foolishness." And so, trembling, he reenacts the whisper, the silly grin, the leaning shoulder. His classmates laugh, some nervously, others with genuine amusement. The punishment is doubled. He is forced not only into shame but into comedy, performing his mischief as though on stage. Sometimes it was harsher still. A child caught slouching might be made to walk the length of the classroom with exaggerated, drooping shoulders, mocked as lazy. One who stammered might be forced to repeat their mistake aloud, again and again, each slip greeted with cruel chuckles. A girl who mispronounced a word might be told to say it wrong 10 times in front of all, her error becoming a spectacle, her face burning hotter with each attempt. Teachers believed this method clever. By turning faults into theatre, they taught lessons to all at once. The punished child became a warning. This is what happens when you stray. The laughter of classmates was encouraged, meant to sharpen shame into obedience. But for the children, the wound went deeper than laughter. To have one's weakness displayed, to be made into a clown for others, carved humiliation into memory. Many remembered those moments for life. The giggles of peers louder than any strap, the feeling of being both performer and fool. And yet rebellion stirred even here. Some children leaned into the performance, exaggerating every movement until the class laughed with them rather than at them. A punished boy might shuffle like a comical puppet, bowing with theatrical flair, turning mockery into shared joke. Others turned red cheeks into grins, refusing to let shame hold them. Still, not all could muster such defiance. For many, the punishment taught fear of mistakes, the dread of being singled out. Words stumbled on their tongues, postures stiffened unnaturally, laughter became something to avoid rather than enjoy. Picture the classroom after dismissal. The punished child lingers, slow to pack away their slate, cheeks still hot with remembered laughter. Outside, friends might offer small comforts, a pat on the shoulder, a whispered joke that says we know it wasn't so bad. Yet the sting lingers, heavier than lines or chores. These theatrical punishments show us how deeply Victorian schooling blurred the line between learning and performance. The classroom was not only a place of lessons, but a stage where authority directed, and children, willingly or not, played their parts. And so, as the last echoes of forced laughter fade from the schoolroom walls, we turn to another form of punishment. This one was quieter, stranger, and perhaps even more unsettling. Punishments tied not to behavior in the moment, but to memory. Long lessons repeated endlessly, until a child's very thoughts bent under the weight of rote. The echoes of forced laughter die away, the classroom once more sinking into the hush of chalk and ink. Yet Victorian punishments did not always rely on canes, straps, or shameful spectacles. Sometimes the discipline was quieter, subtler, but just as heavy. The punishment of endless repetition. To learn by rote was already the rule of education, but as a punishment, it became a kind of prison for the mind. Imagine a schoolroom in 1880. A boy has failed to recite his multiplication tables. His punishment is not the cane nor the cap, but a task that feels unending. He is made to stand at the front of the class, slate in hand, and repeat. 6 times 6 is 36. 6 times 7 is 42. Again and again, his voice dull and low, the words flattening into meaningless sounds. At first, the class listens with nervous attention, but as the minutes stretch, the boy's voice fades into background noise. The repetition drones on, a chant that dulls not only his mind, but the minds of all who hear. Picture a girl punished for stumbling in spelling. She's told to write the same word 50 times, then 100, then 200. Her fingers cramp, chalk dust coats her hands, her eyes blur as the word loses shape. Discipline, she writes again and again, until the letters twist and tumble into nonsense. The punishment is not pain but monotony, the weight of sameness pressing heavily on her spirit. Sometimes repetition took stranger forms. A child might be made to recite a poem they did not understand again and again, until their voice cracked with exhaustion. Others were tasked with copying entire passages from the Bible, each verse repeated line by line, until ink stained their hands and wrists trembled from fatigue. For teachers, repetition seemed ideal. It filled time, demanded focus, and turned error into lesson. If a child faltered, they could be corrected not by blows but by words etched endlessly until they left their mark. They will remember this, if nothing else, the masters thought. But for children, it was torment by tedium. The mind wandered, the body ached, and the very act of learning soured into punishment. What might have been knowledge became noise. What might have been memory became monotony. And yet, even here, small rebellions sparked. Some children scribbled extra fast, squashing words into tight lines to finish sooner. Others copied not the assigned sentence, but jokes or secret notes, hiding them between the endless lines. A few whispered recitations under their breath, turning monotony into song, mocking the punishment with melody. Still, most bore it in weary silence. Their hands cramped, their eyes blurred, and when at last they were released, they carried home not new knowledge but a dull hatred for the task itself. Imagine the classroom at twilight. Rows of slates filled with repeated words gleam faintly in the fading light. The punished children, exhausted, leave at last, their voices hoarse, their hands sore. They walk into the evening air, relieved to be free, though the chant of numbers or verses still echoes faintly in their ears. The punishment of endless repetition reveals something deep about Victorian schooling. It was not only about correcting behaviour, but about drilling submission into the very act of learning. Knowledge, discipline, and punishment blurred into one until the difference between lesson and penalty disappeared. And so, as the last lines are wiped from the slates, the chalky rags left sodden in their buckets, we move to the final chapter. This one gathers all the threads together. Silence, shame, pain, labour, repetition, and reflects on what Victorian punishments tell us about a world that saw childhood not as freedom, but as something to be tamed. The slates are wiped clean, the chalk dust settled, and the echoes of endless repetition fade into the silence of evening. The schoolroom, with its canes and caps, its tokens and traps, lies quiet at last. Yet the shadows of its punishments linger, etched into the wood of the desks, the walls, and the memories of all who once endured them. When we think back to Victorian classrooms, we see not only the lessons of reading and arithmetic, but the strange and often cruel rituals of discipline. The medals of silence, heavy upon small chests, the thumb traps, pinching tender skin until the hand ached, the dunce caps, tall and humiliating, turning children into spectacles, the rulers and straps, the sting across knuckles, the welt across palms, the chores that left fingers raw, the detentions that stole time, the exile into cold yards where breath shivered in the air. Each punishment tells us something about the age that created them. The Victorians believed discipline shaped character, that stillness bred virtue, that silence trained obedience. Childhood was not seen as play, but as preparation, for work, for service, for a life of endurance. And so the punishments reflected these ideals: silence for disobedience, labour for idleness, cold for weakness, shame for folly. Imagine the children themselves, rows upon rows of small bodies in stiff clothing, their eyes downcast, their voices hushed. They lived in a world where even laughter could be stolen, where joy was conditional, where play was a privilege easily withdrawn. Yet within them, rebellion sparked like hidden embers. They whispered jokes behind teachers' backs. They carved initials into desks. They made games even of their punishments. Childhood found ways to survive, even in the sternest classrooms. Picture the school at dusk. The master is gone, his cane resting upon the desk, his gown hung neatly upon a peg. The room is still, but if you listen closely, you can almost hear the ghosts of lessons and punishments past. The scratch of chalk, the hum of whispered sums, the sharp crack of ruler on knuckles, the muffled laughter that followed once the sting was gone. The room is empty, yet alive with echoes. In truth, the punishments of Victorian schools were as much theatre as they were discipline. They relied on spectacle, on shame made visible, on silence made heavy, on laughter turned into ridicule. They taught obedience not just through fear, but through the ever-present possibility of being made an example. And yet, these same punishments reveal the resilience of children. No matter the silence medal, the dunce cap, the freezing yard, they found ways to endure, to bend without breaking. Their whispers, their laughter, their secret rebellions remind us that even in the strictest systems, the spirit of youth remains stubbornly alive. Now, as we close this journey, let your mind drift gently away from those harsh classrooms. Imagine the children stepping out of the schoolhouse, the air cool upon their cheeks, the streets alive with play once more. Their punishments are behind them, their laughter rushing forward, their freedom brief but bright. The shadows of rulers and caps fade into the evening fog, replaced by the timeless joy of running feet and ringing voices. And here, we too may let the punishments fade, like chalk dust brushed from a slate. What remains is not the sting of cane or the weight of silence, but the memory of how children endured, how they found warmth in friendship, mischief in monotony, and courage even in the face of shame. So, close your eyes now. Let the wooden desks and cold floors slip away. Let the sharp voices soften into whispers, the sting of rulers melt into silence. May the memories of those classrooms settle gently, like dusk upon the schoolyard, guiding you into quiet dreams. And if this long, gentle journey helped you drift, you may softly tap like or subscribe, only if it feels right. No pressure. Just a small way of saying you'd like more stories to carry you toward rest. Now, dear friend, let the gaslight fade, let the fog curl around quiet streets, and let sleep take you gently like a teacher finally dismissing the class with a nod. Sweet dreams until we meet again. Good night.